I grew up in a sprawling white brick colonial on the outskirts of Fairfield, Connecticut, the kind of house that made neighbors slow down when they drove past. The front porch wrapped around the entire facade, framed by pristine white railings, and wicker chairs with cushions that never seemed to fade in the sun. Our hedges were trimmed to geometric perfection, and the black-tiled driveway gleamed like polished stone, wide enough to fit 5 cars without anyone having to shuffle around. From the outside, our home looked like a portrait of the American dream: prosperous, secure, enviable. Inside, though, the picture was less perfect. It was like living in a museum, where only one painting had perfect lighting, while the others sat in dim corners collecting dust. My younger sister Lila was the masterpiece. She was the golden child with the effortless charm, the one everyone noticed when she walked into a room. I was the quiet shadow in the hallway, acknowledged only in passing. Our father, Charles Davenport, was a corporate attorney in Manhattan, the type of man who wore suits that cost more than my first year's rent in college housing. He carried himself with a weight that made people instinctively step out of his way. Even at home, his voice carried an authority that didn't invite debate. My mother, Evelyn, played her role as the perfect hostess and philanthropist, bouncing from charity luncheons to spa retreats, always dressed as if she were about to have her photograph taken for a lifestyle magazine. They adored Lila. If she scored a goal in a high school field hockey game, there was champagne in the kitchen that night. If she tried a new haircut, my mother booked a professional photographer to capture her fresh look. My achievements, on the other hand, often slipped by unnoticed. When I won first place in the regional economics essay competition, my father muttered, "Good for you," without looking up from his newspaper. I was still at the dinner table when they started discussing Lila's upcoming school play and the dress she would wear for opening night. By the time I turned 18, I had learned not to expect much from them. Still, when I got my acceptance letter to Columbia University's economics program, something in me stirred. Maybe this would be different. Maybe they would see me, even if just for a moment. I carried the letter into the kitchen one evening, the gold crest on the envelope practically glowing in my hand. I remember how proud I felt as I told them the news, how my voice almost wavered with excitement. Their reaction was a blunt, calculated blow. My father didn't congratulate me. He simply said, "We won't be paying for your tuition." My mother nodded, her lips pressed together in that polite but distant smile she used at parties when she didn't want to offend, but also didn't care. The reason they gave was simple and infuriating. They were saving for Lila's future. I felt the words like a door slamming shut. The Columbia acceptance letter might as well have been a grocery receipt for all the value it held in their eyes. It was then that I realized that in my family, love came with terms and conditions, and I had failed to meet them. But I didn't have the luxury of sulking. I refused to let their refusal define the rest of my life. That summer, I built a schedule that would break most people. Mornings, I worked at Marlowe's Bakery, starting at 5 a.m. to prepare trays of croissants, muffins, and cinnamon rolls for the early crowd. The sweet smell of baked bread clung to me long after I'd clocked out. Afternoons, I tutored high school students in math and economics at the local library, patiently guiding them through algebra problems and essay outlines. Evenings, I sat behind the desk at a small accounting firm, answering phones and filing documents until 9 p.m. Every dollar I earned went into a battered navy envelope I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. I counted it weekly, watching the stack of bills grow, whispering numbers to myself like a mantra. Rent? No. Tuition, books, MetroCard. This was my way out, one tip and a paycheck at a time. Lila, of course, floated through that summer as though nothing had changed. My parents took her on shopping trips to Manhattan, hosted pool parties for her friends, and even surprised her with a weekend getaway to Martha's Vineyard. I'd come home from a 12-hour day smelling like yeast and printer ink to find her sprawled on the sofa, flipping through glossy magazines, chattering about what color dress she should wear for her senior portraits. The day I finally had enough for my first semester's tuition, I walked into the bank with the envelope pressed against my chest. The teller, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, counted the cash slowly, looking up at me only once to ask, "This for something big?" I told him yes. I didn't mention that this money was my ticket to a life that would be mine alone, unshaped by anyone else's approval. When fall arrived, I moved into a small, drafty apartment in Morningside Heights with 2 other girls I barely knew. My room was hardly bigger than a walk-in closet, but it had a single window that looked out over Broadway. On nights when I couldn't sleep, I'd watch the city lights flicker and remind myself that I was here on my terms. My Metro card lived in the front pocket of my worn leather satchel, and every time I swiped it at the subway turnstile, it felt like a tiny victory. Columbia was overwhelming at first. The campus buzzed with a constant hum of ambition, students darting from lecture halls to study groups, professors whose names appeared on the spines of the very textbooks we used. I felt small, anonymous, but strangely free. No one here knew I was the invisible daughter of Charles and Evelyn Davenport. No one here compared me to Lila. I could be whoever I wanted to be. Looking back, that first year was the beginning of everything. I didn't know yet that it would lead me to an idea, a team, and a company that would change my life forever. All I knew was that for the first time, I was walking a path that was entirely mine, and no one could take that away from me. Columbia felt like another planet compared to the quiet, calculated world I'd left behind in Fairfield. The campus was alive with possibility. Every hallway buzzing with conversations about theories, business models, or political debates that seemed like they could change the world. Even the coffee shops were electric, their small tables crammed with open laptops and students who treated caffeine like oxygen. I remember thinking that I'd stepped into the beating heart of ambition itself. I threw myself into my coursework, determined not just to pass, but to truly absorb every concept. My professors weren't just teachers. They were industry leaders, people whose names were printed on the covers of our textbooks. Sitting in their lectures felt like being let in on secrets that could alter the trajectory of my life. It was during my second semester, on a rainy Tuesday evening, that the spark for everything began. I was holed up in a cramped study lounge on the 4th floor of Butler Library. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old books, its fluorescent lights flickering in an almost rhythmic pattern. Across from me sat my friend Amara, scrolling through her phone with growing frustration. She was trying to send money to her family back in Spain, but the fees were astronomical, and the transfer time was several days. Something about her struggle lodged in my mind. I couldn't shake the thought, why, in a world where we could send an email across the globe in seconds, did moving money still feel like mailing a letter in the 1800s? The question followed me home that night and wouldn't let go. By the weekend, I'd started scribbling ideas in my notebook. At first, they were rough, more questions than answers. How could transactions be faster? How could fees be reduced without compromising security? Could blockchain technology play a role without alienating the everyday user? I didn't know it yet, but those messy pages would become the blueprint for Swift Ledger, my real-time, low-fee financial technology platform. The problem was that I had the vision, but not the technical skills to bring it to life. So I did what I always did when something seemed impossible. I taught myself. Nights that I wasn't working, I sat at my desk, hunched over my old laptop, devouring coding tutorials. I wasn't trying to become an expert, just competent enough to communicate my ideas to someone who could code in their sleep. That someone turned out to be Jason Park, a junior in the computer science program. We met at a campus entrepreneurship networking event, both of us standing awkwardly by the snack table until I asked what he was working on. He told me about a failed app he'd built for restaurant reservations and laughed at how no one but his mom ever downloaded it. I told him about my idea for a better money transfer system. By the end of the night, we'd agreed to meet again, just to see if we could make something work. I also knew we needed guidance, someone who could see the blind spots we didn't even know existed. That's where Professor Marianne Blake came in. She was my economics mentor, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper wit, who never sugarcoated feedback but also never underestimated a student willing to work. When I pitched her the concept, she listened without interrupting, then leaned back and said, "If you're serious, I'll advise you. But only if you're prepared to eat, sleep, and breathe this project for the next few years." I didn't hesitate. I told her I was already doing that. The following months blurred into a constant cycle of classes, jobs, and development sessions. My mornings still started at Marlowe's Bakery. My afternoons were filled with lectures, and my evenings ended with Jason and me coding in whichever library nook we could find. Professor Blake met with us weekly, pushing us to refine our user interface, test our security protocols, and think like the investors we hoped to attract. Money was tight. My bank account rarely held more than $200. And every unexpected expense, a broken phone charger, a textbook I couldn't borrow from the library, felt like a crisis. I stopped buying meals on campus and lived off the cafeteria's cheapest coffee and peanut butter sandwiches. Sleep was optional. My friends joked that I'd become part of the library furniture. After nearly 2 years of work, we finally had a functional prototype. It wasn't pretty, the interface was clunky, and some features only worked if you didn't click in the wrong place. But it proved the concept. That's when Professor Blake suggested we apply for the National Collegiate Startup Competition. I laughed at first. This was an event that drew hundreds of entries from the most prestigious universities in the country, with venture capitalists and angel investors filling the audience. But she didn't smile when she said, "You're ready." The application process alone was brutal. We spent weeks refining our pitch deck, running financial projections, and rehearsing our presentation until I could recite it without notes. When the day of the competition arrived, I didn't even own a suit. Jason lent me his spare jacket, which was a size too big, and I paired it with the only formal skirt I had. Standing backstage, I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The teams before us had slick graphics, polished demos, and funding already in place. We had a scrappy prototype and a story about 2 students who refused to accept the inefficiency of an outdated system. When it was my turn, I stepped into the spotlight, took a breath, and began. I didn't try to sound like the smartest person. In the room, I just told them the truth. I spoke about Amara's struggle, about the millions of people facing the same barriers, and about how Swift Ledger could be their solution. I saw heads nodding in the audience, pens scribbling notes, and when I finished, the applause was more than polite. It was genuine. Hours later, when the winners were announced, I nearly didn't register our name being called for first place. Jason grabbed my arm, grinning like a maniac, and we walked on stage to accept the award, a $250,000 seed investment and a year of mentorship from a leading fintech accelerator. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I didn't need my parents to be proud, or for Lila to notice. I was building something real, something that didn't require permission to exist. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. By my final year at Columbia, Swift Ledger was no longer the scrappy side project that Jason and I had once nursed between coffee breaks and library sessions. It had grown into a living, breathing company, one with actual employees, a buzzing office space in Midtown, and a product that was starting to make real ripples in the financial world. We'd closed a $5 million Series A funding round, hired a lean but brilliant team of 12, and were knee-deep in partnership talks with 2 major banks. I was juggling classes, investor meetings, and product launches like plates in the air, but for the first time, it all felt worth the exhaustion. Graduation. Season was approaching, and the university sent out formal invitations for the ceremony. The golden seal of Columbia gleamed against the heavy cream-colored cardstock, the kind of envelope you almost hesitate to open because it feels so official. For most students, it was a family milestone, a day for parents to beam from the RA, audience and siblings to wave from the back rows. For me, it was complicated. I called home one Sunday afternoon expecting a short civil conversation. My father picked up, his voice carrying the clipped precision I'd grown up with. "I wanted to let you know the date for my graduation," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. There was a pause, followed by the inevitable. "We can't make it," he said. "Lila's high school graduation party is that same weekend, and we're hosting a big celebration. You understand?" The words hit me like a familiar bruise. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the sunlight streaming through my apartment window. The same old script was playing again. Lila first, me somewhere on the cutting room floor. After a beat, I simply replied, "You're welcome if you change your mind," and ended the call. My throat felt tight, but I pushed the disappointment into the same corner of my mind where I kept all the other slights, a place that was getting uncomfortably full. A week before the ceremony, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was different this time. Sweet, almost too sweet, and tinged with a nervous energy. "We heard you're going to be speaking on stage," she began carefully. "And there's going to be some sort of announcement?" It didn't take a genius to figure out where she'd gotten that information. Columbia had been sending out press releases about the ceremony's special honorees, and my name had started popping up in articles online. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I simply said, "You'll have to wait and see." Her reply was, quick, almost too quick. "We'll be there." On the morning of graduation, the air in New York was crisp and bright, with a faint breeze sweeping through the streets. I slipped into my navy cap and gown in the green room behind the stage, pinning my hair so it wouldn't fly into my face. Jason was there too, grinning like a kid at Christmas, adjusting his gown while making jokes about tripping on stage. Professor Blake found me just before lineup, giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You earned this," she said, her voice firm. "Remember that when you're up there." The auditorium was packed, rows upon rows of proud parents, eager graduates, and flashing cameras. From the stage, the sea of faces looked endless. I spotted my parents about halfway back, sitting stiffly, their eyes locked on the podium. The ceremony began with the usual formalities: speeches from faculty, awards for academic excellence, and applause that rolled like waves through the room. Then the Dean of Columbia Business School stepped up to the microphone. "And now, our final honoree," he said, scanning the audience with a smile. "This year, we recognize a student whose vision and determination turned a college project into a billion-dollar financial technology company before she even collected her diploma." The applause was immediate and thunderous. My name echoed through the hall, and for a moment, I let myself breathe it in. I walked to the podium, the tassel of my cap brushing my cheek, the stage lights warm on my face. I began my speech not with numbers or titles, but with gratitude. For Jason, for Professor Blake, for the friends who dragged me out of the library for midnight pizza when I was close to burning out. I talked about the nights we worked until sunrise, the prototypes that crashed minutes before demos, the near-empty bank account that somehow never stopped me from showing up. I did not mention my parents. It wasn't out of spite, though part of me knew they might take it that way. It was because this moment belonged to the people who had shown up for me when no one else did. The ones who believed in me when my dreams were still scribbles in a notebook. When I finished, the standing ovation was like a wave breaking over me. Loud, warm, undeniable. I stepped off stage to find Jason waiting with a grin so wide it nearly split his face, and Professor Blake clapping with that rare, proud smile she saved for moments that truly mattered. Later, as the crowd spilled into the lobby, my parents approached. My father's handshake was firm, his words short. Impressive. My mother kissed my cheek and said, "We had no idea it was this big." I smiled politely, but inside I knew nothing had changed. Their sudden interest was just another ripple in the pattern I'd known all my life. And that was fine, because I no longer needed their approval to feel proud. That night I celebrated with my real circle, the team, my friends, my mentors. We crowded into a tiny rooftop bar downtown, string lights swaying overhead, the skyline glittering beyond. We toasted with cheap champagne and laughed until our sides ached. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about who wasn't there. I was surrounded by the people who had helped me climb, and that was enough. The weeks after graduation were a blur, the kind of blur that doesn't come from exhaustion, alone, but from the sheer velocity of change. My days are filled with back-to-back investor meetings, press interviews, and speaking invitations at industry events. I was still finishing final deliverables for my last Columbia courses while running a company that was suddenly worth over $1 billion. It felt surreal. There were moments when I would catch my reflection in a glass building downtown and barely recognize the woman looking back, confident, determined, and moving with purpose. One of the first things I did after graduation was to finalize the launch of the Davenport Foundation, my nonprofit dedicated to funding education for underprivileged women pursuing careers in technology. The idea had been simmering for years, born from the memory of counting crumpled dollar bills in my bedroom while wondering how I'd pay for another semester. I wanted to make sure other women like me didn't have to choose between their potential and their bank account. Our first year's budget was $3 million, and we had already lined up partnerships with community colleges and tech boot camps across the country. In the middle of that whirlwind, Lila called me. We hadn't spoken beyond polite text messages in months. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "Can we meet?" she asked. "Somewhere quiet?" We chose a little cafe in Greenwich, a far cry from the elegant brunch spots our parents favored. The walls were lined with mismatched bookshelves, and the air smelled of cinnamon and freshly ground coffee. She arrived in a simple sweater and jeans, no designer logos, no carefully styled curls. It was the first time I'd seen her like that. In years. She stirred her tea slowly before speaking. "You know, it wasn't as easy for me as it looked," she began. I almost laughed, not out of mockery, but because I'd spent so many years assuming her life had been effortless. They put me on a pedestal so high I was terrified to fall, she continued. Every move I made had to be perfect. Every grade, every game, every outfit. It wasn't about what I wanted, it was about keeping them happy. She paused, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "I didn't realize how much pressure I was under until I saw you doing everything your way. I envied you for that." Her words cracked something open in me. For the first time, I saw her not as the golden child, but as another casualty of our parents' impossible expectations. We were just two women who had been shaped, and in some ways warped, by the same household. We talked for hours about the weight we'd both carried, about the resentment we'd let harden between us, about the possibility of starting fresh. By the time we left, the air between us felt lighter. Not perfect, not healed, but open. My relationship with my parents shifted too, though not in the way they might have hoped. I learned quickly that success didn't erase the patterns of a lifetime. They came to more of my public events now, smiling for photos, introducing me to their friends as our brilliant daughter. But I knew better than to confuse visibility with intimacy. I stopped chasing their approval like it was oxygen. I started setting boundaries. I invited them to events when it made sense, but I didn't measure my worth by their attendance or their applause. Instead, I poured my energy into my chosen family, the people who had been there when I was just a girl with a Metro card and a dream. Jason, who could still make me laugh after a 12-hour workday. Professor Blake, who had a permanent seat at my dinner table. Amara, whose early frustration with sending money had sparked the very idea for Swift Ledger, is now running our European operations. My townhouse in Tribeca became the center of that circle. The first time I hosted a dinner there, I looked around at the long table crowded with friends, colleagues, and mentors, all talking over each other, their laughter spilling into the high-ceilinged room. The space, once filled with quiet resentment in my mind's memory, now glowed with warmth. We toasted to each other's wins, comforted each other's losses, and reminded one another that none of us had to fight our battles alone anymore. The company kept growing. Swift Ledger expanded into 5 new countries within 2 years, and the foundation funded over 300 scholarships in its first year alone. Every milestone was sweeter because I knew the road I'd taken to get there. Not the easy road, not the one paved by family connections or parental investments. My road. Sometimes people would ask me if I'd forgiven my parents. I never quite knew how to answer. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't about pretending the hurt never happened. It was about no longer letting it dictate my choices. I had stopped waiting for them to become the parents I needed when I was 18. That chapter was over. What I had gained instead was resilience, the kind that's forged in the quiet, in the absence of applause, in the space between rejection and the decision to try anyway. That resilience was my advantage. It made me a better leader, a better sister, a better friend. One evening, after a long day at the office, I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker across the Hudson. My phone buzzed with a message from Lila. "Proud of you. Always." It was short, simple, and more meaningful than anything she'd said to me in years. I smiled, not because I needed the words, but because they came without expectation. No strings attached. In the end, The years of being overlooked had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. When no one expects you to shine, you have the freedom to surprise them. And sometimes you even surprise yourself.